Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. It was an election race that appeared to be neck and neck right down to the wire, but Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. So what was behind his win, and what will this mean for relations with Canada and the world? We'll be taking your calls today. I'm Amy Bell, in for Michelle Elliott, and this is BC Today. And thank you so much for joining us on radio, TV, and live stream. You can call us now on our top story. How do you feel about the results of last night's U.S. election? And what do you think a second Trump presidency will look like? Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also call 1-800-825-5950 or just hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And always, you can email us bctoday@cbc.ca. Donald Trump has, of course, won the U.S. presidential election, defeating Democratic candidate Kamala Harris. Trump is poised to become the 47th president of the United States, winning the popular vote for the first time. He is the first president since the 1800s to serve a second term following a defeat. Trump says he's ready to put economic prosperity and the American people front and center.
I will govern by a simple motto: promises made, promises kept. We're going to keep our promises. Nothing will stop me from keeping my word to you, the people. We will make America safe, strong, prosperous, powerful, and free again. And I'm asking every citizen all across our land to join me in this noble and righteous endeavor. That's what it is. It's time to put the divisions of the past 4 years behind us. It's time to unite.
So how do you feel about last night's U.S. election results? What do you think a second Trump presidency term will look like? Call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone, and email us bctoday@cbc.ca. For more on this, we are joined by UBC political science professor Max Cameron. Hello, Max. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Amy. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Max, what's your reaction to Trump being elected to his second term?
Not entirely surprised. However, I'm deeply concerned. I think U.S. voters have chosen a strong man, and he is going to have an extraordinary amount of power. He has total control over his political party. He's won the presidency, the Senate, maybe the House, and has a compliant court. And so this is an enormous amount of power to put in the hands of an individual whose commitment to democratic norms and democratic institutions is very weak. We've seen his attempt to disrupt the transition of power back in 2020. He comes into office with grievances, with a desire for revenge, and not a lot of respect for existing institutions. And so I think the United States is really in for a pretty bumpy ride in the next 4 years.
And what are some of, you say they're in for a bumpy ride. What are some examples of consequences you could foresee with Trump's, presidency and, as you mentioned, his attitude going into it and having so much of the balance of power?
Well, I spent a lot of time studying the impact of the rise of strongmen in democratic politics. A lot of my work is focused on Latin America. And so I look at leaders like Fujimori and Chavez, Evo Morales. And I think we can see some real patterns in terms of how strongmen behave in office. They often come in with a tremendous amount of confidence that they've been elected to govern. They have a mandate to govern. In the case of Trump, he has half the country behind him. And they tend to see the restraining influences, checks and balances, as nuisances that get in the way of their achieving their mandate.
Right.
Often there's a certain amount of enthusiasm. The opposition is in disarray and trying to come to terms with what's happened. The supporters are elated. And after a period of time, as these leaders try to drive through their radical agenda for change, opposition builds up, divisions emerge. And that's the point at which the behavior of the strongman becomes terribly important, because if they choose at that moment to try to bypass existing institutions, to ignore the will of the people's elected representatives, the rule of law, checks and balances, they can do real harm to a democratic constitution. So I would give Trump a few months of a honeymoon, maybe even less. And then I think he's going to encounter considerable resistance. And then we're going to have to see how he behaves in the face of that kind of limitation on his power.
That pushback to power. We're going to take a call now from Brad in Vancouver. Hi, Brad.
Hello.
How are you feeling after last night's U.S. election?
I think it was a disaster all around for the U.S., for Canada, for the world. I don't see an upside to it anywhere.
No. And when you say you have concerns for Canada, what are some examples of those concerns?
Well, I think that there are forces in our own country that want to move in the same direction, and I think this will embolden them. I think that we have to be very concerned about protecting our institutions and our human rights and our access to things like appropriate reproductive care for women. And all of that is now, I think, at risk. And then internationally, I think the world must be feeling shockwaves throughout, and particularly Ukraine. I can only imagine how concerned they are at the prospect of being completely abandoned.
Brad, thank you for raising those points, and that certainly echoes what we've heard from a lot of people in the past. Max, what are some preparations that perhaps Canada should be making, when it comes to, the tariffs that Trump wants to enact and policies that could directly impact people in Canada?
Well, you could just hear people doing face plants in Ottawa as they grapple with being back where we were in 2016 and needing to really devote a lot of attention to the U.S.-Canada relations to try to mitigate the effects of some of the policies that Trump has proposed. If he really goes forward with the idea of slapping major tariffs on everything, that has huge consequences for Canada. We are one of the most integrated countries in the world. And that's just the trade issue. There's also the broader diplomatic, defense, and global economic issues. The United States, for many, many decades, has held together the global international order, the IMF, the World Bank, the NATO. And without U.S. leadership, I think we face real turmoil in other parts of the world. I think we're already seeing some of this in the Middle East and in the Ukraine. And so Canadian government officials, I think, are going to have to focus on this. And I suspect it'll absorb just a huge amount of their attention.
And Maxwell also raised the point that we've seen this move towards, with the Republicans being quite conservative and more to the right. And we are beginning to see that here. We saw that in our provincial election just a few weeks back, with it nearly evenly split between the NDP and for the BC Conservatives. And that's a reality that could play out in the federal election with Poilievre versus Trump. Why are we seeing that shift in many places, I should add, around that world, returning to or shifting to the right, whereas many places might have been more liberal and left-leaning in the past?
I think that's a really important observation, that we are seeing this globally. And certainly in British Columbia, we saw in the last election the way in which conservatives really channeled anger and frustration about the high cost of living, housing, issues of safety on our streets, and so forth. And sometimes what we see is the right is ascendant, the right is increasingly aggressive about its policy proposals. That's getting traction, particularly in rural areas, what we saw in BC outside the lower mainland, with some of the suburbs becoming battlegrounds, and the NDP's support being primarily in Vancouver and Vancouver Island. And so the NDP has become a bit of a defender of the status quo, much like the Democrats in the United States. What passes for the left today is trying to hold the ship on an even keel.
Right.
And it's the conservatives who have the momentum. And what you see in the conservatives is not just people seeking to win office to govern, but building social movements like the truckers convoy here in Canada, or MAGA in the United States, and we've seen comparable examples in Europe. They really want to change the system. They're anti-system in many respects. I wouldn't say that so much of the conservatives locally, but I think federally for sure, Polyev, while being more democratic than Trump, he hasn't attempted any of the shenanigans that Trump has, or lied about the outcome of elections, at least not yet. But he certainly does represent that kind of movement-based approach, or kind of a populist and nationalist approach to politics, which seems to be spreading around the world.
Okay. We'd love to have more people call in and join our discussion. As always, you can reach us at 1-800-825-5950. You can also call 604-669-3733. Email us bctoday@cbc.ca. We're going to take a call now from Derek in Abbotsford. Hi, Derek. What are your thoughts on last night's election?
I think it's a positive change, and I think it speaks volumes. The people can't afford to eat, can't afford to live under the last administration, and it's a positive thing, and the people have spoken, and obviously Kamala Harris didn't actually speak for what the people wanted.
And
right?
do you think Trump will change these issues, that he will make things more affordable and that there will be more housing for people as a result of his presidency?
Yeah, I mean, the last time he was in power, there was no wars, and now we got two wars on two different fronts. I mean, he says he wants to end that, so we'll just have to wait and see what he does. But, yeah, and I think, also the World Economic Forum and their goals and stuff too also plays. I think a lot of people voted the other way because they don't want this new agenda that we seem to be following.
And what agenda is that?
Well, the Great Reset. I think a lot of people are awake to that. Well, we don't want all this. It's almost. I think that's the foreign interference, is the World Economic Forum and all these politicians that are going to these meetings to talk about the fourth industrial revolution. And I think a lot of people are waking up to that, and they don't want that. And Trump doesn't stand for that.
All right, Derek, thank you for adding that to our discussion. And Max, there's obviously a lot to what Derek just said. Let's start with how, I guess, influential U.S. presidents are, when it comes to these international conflicts and war. Will Trump be able to somehow settle the Middle East or make peace between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I on that point, I would simply say that some of these conflicts, and particularly the one in the Ukraine, are largely a reflection of the deterioration of the international liberal order. And that's a reflection in part of the first Trump administration and more generally, American decline. But I think the caller makes an interesting point, though, because there's no question that the strength of Trump's campaign was on the economy and the people's belief that he would bring about economic change. The strength of the Harris campaign was the defense of democracy and women's reproductive rights. And it appears that in the balance of those two things, a slim majority of people favored the economic agenda of Trump. I do think that economic agenda responds to the perception that the United States has become too globalized, that elites have benefited from globalization and from policies like NAFTA, which, remember, the Democrats embraced, and the perception that the Democrats abandoned their working class and middle class base. To me, it's extraordinary that someone like Trump, surrounded by other oligarchs, would offer an economic vision of the country that seems more connected to people's concern about the disappearing American dream and wanting to see that mobility and opportunity to come back. And the Democrats have not presented an answer to that. In that respect, at least I would agree with Derek.
All right. We'll get another call in from Rob in Vancouver. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
And how are you feeling today after last night's election?
Well, yeah, I mean, not good. I think Trump's character is, atrocious. I just wanted to offer my take on it. I think the number one thing that influences how people vote in any election is usually how they think and feel about their financial situation.
Mm.
So we had this high inflation in 2022, right? We raised costs, and wages haven't yet increased to kind of correct for that. So regardless of all the other strong indicators in the U.S., like job growth, whatever, they're just feeling this pinch. Our society doesn't do a good job of educating people about economics. You don't learn anything about it really in high school, especially how inflation works.
Mm-hmm.
So when people feel this, they just think it must be the current government's fault, even though, to my knowledge, the only real solution to inflation is higher interest rates. So the solution to the pain of inflation is the more pain from interest rates. But I think, people just felt that pain, and therefore when that happens, they want to vote for another government. That's why the Conservatives in Canada are up in the polls. Mm-hmm. So when you consider that, the Democrats in the U.S. actually did fairly well. And when you add to the fact that, there's a lot of folks with a bias against people of color and against women, actually, the Democrats did it quite well considering how tight this was. So, yes, some people vote for Trump because they like his rhetoric about LGBTQ and immigrants and all that. But I think a lot of people don't pay attention to details, and they just feel life is more expensive. It must be the current government's fault. So maybe that's a ray of hope as to what was motivating people in this election.
Fair. Thank you for that, Rob. And Max, I can see you nodding along. And it's that seems to be, quite a general consensus that when it comes down to it, it's not about the rights of others. It is about the economy and how they are feeling in that economy, despite the fact that what they're feeling may have been started when Trump was in office for the first time. Obviously Trump sort of campaigned on insults and name calling, not telling truths all the time. I'm also worth mentioning he is the first convicted felon to be heading to the White House. What political precedents does this set, though? Are you concerned about what this may allow in future presidential or any leadership race?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was concerned when Trump was first elected that he didn't appear to have the kind of character that you expect in a leader that will lead them to honor and respect institutions and to govern democratically. And we saw that at the end of his term in particular when he tried to disrupt the transition of power. Now he comes into office having done that, and yet having been rewarded as a convicted felon with a lot of grievances and a desire for revenge.
True.
And, the truth of the matter was, had he not won, he was going to face a continuing series of investigations. And so he's actually safer in power than out of power. And that's precisely the kind of situation that I've observed around the world, whether it's in Bolivia or Venezuela or Brazil, when you get an elected leader who feels safest in power, because when they're not surrounded by power, when they don't have all of the trappings of office and all of the supporters and all of the appointees to defend them, then they're most likely to bend the rules, to bypass institutions, and to act undemocratically. So I think the American electorate, perhaps without being aware of what it's doing, has set itself up for a major test of the country's Republican and democratic institutions.
We've got time for one more quick call. Tristan, in this segment, Tristan in Vancouver. Hi. What are your thoughts quickly?
Hi. I'm actually not surprised. I think if we look at the way that the United States does their media compared to Canada, just in hearing what we just had in our provincial election, it's a much different system. If you listen to the state's news, you listen to anything there, you have multiple sources, what we would call fringe. You have multiple sources in that side. So everybody that's acting surprised, I really don't think they should be, because they have so many more contradictions in their media. Whereas if you listen to, our provincial elections, we have the CBC, which has been generally the center, generally liberal. And then we have a few smaller radio stations and news that are much smaller. So when you look at the states, you look at all of the different news sources. You look at Fox News. They have all these Democratic side news, and you have much different sources of news. So then when people hear about these elections and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Trump got elected. Well, if you have any American friends, you'd know that there's so many more sources.
Okay. Thank you for that, Tristan. And very quickly, Max, how much does the media and politics sort of go hand in hand? You know, is it because they have access to more larger established sources in the States that they have more, I guess, ideas to cherry pick from?
Well, it's funny. Yeah, great observations by the caller. My wife and I call it American hysteria. We sometimes say, "Should we watch a little American hysteria?" You turn on the TV, and whether it's MSNBC or Fox News, the level of the rhetoric, the passion is just extraordinary. So I think that plus social media has really contributed to the polarization in the country. That there's been a loss of trusted sources, publicly supported institutions, whether it's a public broadcaster or newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post. Those institutions are clearly weakened. Social media is far more powerful, and that I think is a major driver of polarization. And what that tells us is that these are precious institutions. We have a well-educated population in Canada. We provide good public services. We've got an excellent public broadcaster and a media environment that's much, much less polarized. And I think that's something that is really important to try to retain, to avoid this kind of politics.
Thank you for that, Max. We'll let you go, but I'm sure we'll be talking to you again very soon. Thank you.
My pleasure.
UBC political science professor Max Cameron. It is 12:27, and this is BC Today. And as we've been hearing, Canadians are also reacting to the news of Donald Trump's re-election to the Oval Office. Here is some of what people in Toronto and Halifax had to say earlier this morning.
I'm scared that whatever policies he puts on might also affect Canada's policies as well.
I'm horrified, and once I get on my train, I'm probably going to cry.
I think he's pro-business. I see that the stock market probably is going to jump. Probably less wars. That's what I'm thinking.
I smiled, happy. I wasn't ecstatic. I don't worship him or anything, but the better of the two options for sure.
Some Canadians reacting this morning about the news of a second Donald Trump presidential term. And we're taking your calls on the U.S. election results throughout this hour. Let us know how you're feeling and your thoughts on what a second Trump presidency will look like. And we are welcoming your calls and your emails today. We've also already had quite a few to BC Today at cbc.ca, so keep them coming. This one is from John in South Surrey. He writes, I know most listeners would rather not hear this. Trump has little regard for Trudeau. It won't matter much because in a year, we will have a right-thinking government. We will happily save our economy by drilling and filling in that pipeline. This morning, Jolie said Canadians are anxious. Maybe the bloated public service and Liberal MPPs, This is the spark the U.S. needs and what we need more of. And we will be taking your calls and emails throughout the next half hour about your response to last night's win of the U.S. election by Donald Trump. This is BC Today. I'm Amy Bell, filling in for Michelle Elliott, and the news with Robert Zimmerman is next.
Good afternoon. BC port employers say they may have to reassess their position on a current offer to more than 700 workers as a lockout shuts down most shipping along the coast. The BC Maritime Employers Association says there has been no engagement with the union since it locked out the workers on Monday in response to strike activity. A statement says their position could change as the shutdown continues. BC's new cabinet will be sworn in November 18th, a month after the election that gave Premier David Eby's NDP the slimmest of majorities pending recounts. Eby says judicial recounts happening in 3 ridings tomorrow and Friday will ensure every vote is counted. And Environment Canada has issued rainfall warnings for much of the north coast. Forecasters say the system will gradually slide south into Kitimat and Terrace and ease over Stewart. The heaviest rain is expected this afternoon. Up to 130 millimeters is expected. And now the forecast on the north coast. Lots of rain, as we mentioned, with strong winds and a high of 10, highs to 7 degrees with sunshine in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, increasing cloudiness with a high of 8, highs around 5 degrees with some sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, increasing cloudiness with a high of 7. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, a bit of sunshine this afternoon with highs around 10. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Robert.
You're welcome.
And we will hear some more of your thoughts on the 2024 U.S. presidential election in just a moment. First, though, here's CBC's John Hernandez from Washington State on how the election went just south of this province.
There are about 5 million registered voters in Washington state. By Wednesday morning, about 2.5 million ballots had been counted. As predicted, the state overwhelmingly voted Democrat, with the bulk of those votes coming from major urban centers. The big election issues here, similar to the rest of the United States, including the economy and affordability.
I'm retired and I don't see anything going down for me. You know, everything keeps going up. I know my health insurance went up again this coming year.
We see how much things cost everybody and how hard it is for them to pay for the goods and services that we provide.
But climate is also a big issue here in Washington state. Similar to BC, Washington is subject to extreme heat, wildfires, floods, and atmospheric rivers. One item on November's ballot was the decision to recently impose a cap and trade program here in Washington state. Voters would decide whether or not to repeal that legislation.
The border means nothing to carbon emissions, right? So any policy that we do related to our emissions, right, that's going to impact people globally because greenhouse gas emissions affect everybody.
Washington voters might not have gotten the president that they wanted. However, they did succeed in voting not to repeal that cap and trade legislation, meaning the state will move forward on its climate commitment plans. John Hernandez, CBC News, Bellingham.
Also last night, 7 out of 10 states approved measures that protected or expanded abortion rights in the U.S. That was Montana, Arizona, Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Nevada, New York, and South Dakota, allowing abortions until 24 weeks. But the abortion access amendments in Florida, Montana, and Nebraska all failed, falling short of the 60% support they needed to pass. Joining us now is Rosemary Westwood, a former CBC Victoria journalist, now living and working in New Orleans as the public and reproductive health reporter for National Public Radio affiliate WWNO and WRKF. Her award-winning podcast, Banned, tells the story of how one case in Mississippi led to Roe v. Wade being overturned in 2022 by the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome to the show, Rosemary.
Thanks very much for having me.
What are your thoughts today?
I think that, so I cover reproductive rights, as you've said, and from that perspective, it's really a mixed bag. The top line that Trump won so decisively, including among voters who said they supported abortion rights in exit polls, really underlines that he has sort of escaped, I think, the consequences of the Roe versus Wade, of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade, more than definitely the Harris campaign would have wanted. They spent so much time trying to convince voters that a Trump presidency would be worse for reproductive rights even than the country sees at the moment, because supporters of Trump are interested in further enacting restrictions in a number of ways we can get into. However, Trump really tried to distance himself from those repercussions. He repeatedly said this is now a state's issue. And that was really a line that I think voters picked up. And also, because there were all these amendments on the ballot in 10 states, voters who supported Trump but also wanted abortion rights in their state could choose that. They could choose both, and they did in many places. So it's really hard to say that abortion was the issue we thought it might be for voters, which isn't to say that it wasn't motivating. I do think it was. It just wasn't, as one reporter put it, the silver bullet that the Harris campaign had hoped for.
Right. And you know, as we've said, Trump stopped short of declaring this national ban on abortion, saying he wanted the power to rest with each state. You know, was that the right stance for him to take, I suppose, to get those votes?
I mean, it seems to have worked, right? His election is pretty decisive, and even, you know, many women, of course, voted for him. A majority of white women voted for Trump, which was also the case when he won in 2016. So I think, yes, I think the other thing to remember is that polling on abortion still shows, you know, and in some of these states we saw that there are a lot of people who do want abortions restricted, and in some cases completely restricted. So South Dakota, where the abortion amendment on the ballot there failed pretty decisively. And when you look at polling that's been done previously around who generally supports abortion in that state, it shows a majority of people do not. So I think one of the other takeaways here isn't just, you know, was Trump able to convince people that he wouldn't further restrict abortion, but also the number of people who do want those restrictions in place.
And, you know, leading up to the election, you know, obviously the topic of abortion and reproductive rights was a main talking point, was a main concern. But broadly, there was a lot of gender divides leading up to the election, most notably that we had a female running against a male. How has that sort of played out, you know, leading up to the election, but also maybe perhaps today, how people will be feeling that, you know, once again, a very well-qualified female candidate was not chosen over their male counterpart?
Right. I'm seeing a lot of that on X, formerly Twitter. I really think that pundits and, you know, the conversations I was seeing around this leading up to the election did, you know, the polling was basically showing this ginormous gender gap, even for young voters. And that was really striking people, I think, as important and as indicative of Harris's support and Trump's lack of support among women. I am seeing, you know, reactions, especially from those who support abortion rights, of like real despondency. I spoke to a former abortion clinic administrator today who felt that this was worse for her than Trump's first election, which, let's not forget, actually overturned Roe versus Wade. But in her mind, this is an instance where Trump had had a term. The impacts of that had been felt in the country, and people still chose him and chose his policies and how they impact women over this qualified woman candidate. I don't think we know what impact it had that Harris had this truncated campaign to run. Obviously, when she was first announced as Biden's successor, there was a huge amount of support and like energy around that. And it almost felt as if that timing was somehow going to help her. I know questions are now being asked about whether it really did, whether a full primary for the Democrats could have helped in some way. Was she, you know, kneecapped a little bit by having such a short campaign to run? Some are definitely wondering, does this just mean that the country doesn't support women leaders.
Yeah.
Like, is that really the takeaway? So I don't think we fully know the answer to that, frankly.
Yeah, it's definitely weighing heavily though on a lot of people this morning, and I'm with you. I do try to stay away from X, but you do see that sentiment being expressed quite a bit. I would love to have more people join us with this conversation for this, and also more broadly how you are feeling after last night's presidential election, where of course Donald Trump was elected. Call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can email us your thoughts, bctoday@cbc.ca. I'm wondering, Rosemary, if you could tell us about how that one legal case in Mississippi resulted in ending the constitutional right to an abortion in the U.S.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this, as you said, was the focus of the podcast I made called Banned. And I just want to say at the outset that a lot of the threads that came up in that reporting have since played out, like women ordering abortion pills online to get their abortions, like the impact on Black health, Black maternal health, like, the impacts in terms of women traveling for care, impacts in terms of women having pregnancies where the fetus won't survive, but yet being forced to carry that pregnancy to term. And what happened in Mississippi was really a case of kind of fortuitous timing for that particular law. The state had passed a 15-week abortion ban. And in 2018, they really felt like they could take an extra stab after Trump was elected, and then at that point had appointed 2 justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. They felt, okay, we can maybe get some movement on the Supreme Court precedents that had up until that point banned states really from infringing on the right to abortion before fetal viability, which is around 23 or 24 weeks. Previous to that, states had passed bans, and there was one in effect in Louisiana where I live, outlawing abortions after 20 weeks, but that had not been challenged. And that's a separate conversation for why, but essentially states had already had on the books pre-viability bans. And the thinking was, can we just go a little bit earlier in pregnancy? Can we further chip away at Roe versus Wade and that foundational precedent that was passed in 1970, in the early 1970s. And so that law was blocked by a district court. It was blocked by the most conservative appeals court in the country, especially on abortion rights, the Fifth Circuit, which is housed here in New Orleans. And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the justice who, was kind of an icon for feminists in the United States, died. She was replaced with Amy Coney Barrett, also a Louisiana native, who was seen as anti-abortion. And after that, the court decided to hear this challenge that Mississippi had to the Fifth Circuit's ruling. Essentially, Mississippi kept going, and it said, okay, these other courts have told us we can't ban abortions at 15 weeks. Supreme Court, what do you say? And the court took the case, which is important because the Supreme Court takes like 1% of all cases, essentially. It's a really small number, and they're very discerning, really. They don't take a case unless there's a good chance that they're going to do something. And they did. I mean, it's important to note that Louisiana had a Supreme Court abortion case a couple years before that, and it was trying to see if Louisiana could have an anti-abortion law that the Supreme Court had already struck down in Texas. And the idea at that point was, can we argue different facts on the ground, and this new Supreme Court under Trump will allow us to enact restrictions in one state that we couldn't in another. And the Supreme Court, really because the Chief Justice's vote, decided not to take that step then. But when Justice Amy Coney Barrett made it to the bench, that's when the court decided to really take this leap and overturn Roe versus Wade. And this was something that anti-abortion groups and grassroots organizers and lawyers and politicians had been trying to achieve, obviously, for 50 years. It was something that they'd laid the groundwork for by creating a conservative legal movement that opposed Roe versus Wade and saw it as bad precedent. And it was sort of perfect timing for the organizers, the anti-abortion organizers in Mississippi, that their case was chosen, in a way for the Supreme Court to sort of take this dramatic stance and overturn that precedent. And it's important to note that the justices who overturned Roe had called it, Supreme Court precedent in their Senate confirmation hearings. And so it's not like people didn't realize that this was a possibility, but the country was really shocked when that happened. And I would say the fallout has continued to really surprise people. It's why you can see someone vote for Trump and for abortion rights. It's become a much more complicated issue, and it's affecting women's health. It's so important to say that 4 women documented have died in connection with state abortion bans, 2 in Georgia, 2 in Texas. There was another case in Texas that's harder to discern that was reported, I think, over a year ago now. In Louisiana, where I live, women are facing challenges in getting care for miscarriages. They're not always able to get care when a fetus is terminally ill. They're not always able to get abortions if they have a health complication that compromises their health, but doesn't compromise it to the degree that the law would say,
Right.
okay, now you can have an abortion. So that is like the important, I think, health consequences of where we are now.
Exactly. And we will get right back to you in a minute, Rosemary, but right now we are just going to take a moment to hear some more from our audience about their reactions to last night's results. We'll head now to John in Fernie. Hi, John.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you feeling about the last night's results?
Awesome. We were stoked to hear that Trump got in down in the States.
And why is that?
Go ahead.
No, why?
My partner is a American citizen, and she's up here. She's a permanent resident, and we just think Trump's going to be good for a nation down there, and just how he is going to deal with the people. Like, for some examples, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and he's really trying to look after the people and trying to build the economy and make people richer than what they are. Try to build themselves back up, right? So I think it was great. It was good to see him. He's a strong leader, and the people behind him, like Elon Musk, Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, those are some great people to have behind him as well. Try to make a difference for that.
All right, John.
Down in the States, right?
Thanks so much for calling in and sharing your thoughts. We'll take a listen now to Jeff in Quesnel. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good. And what did you think about last night's election results?
First off, I was a little bit surprised by how decisive it was. I thought things might be a little bit closer. Maybe that was just listening to the polls.
I think that was the reasoning by a lot of people, that the polls did seem to indicate it would be very much neck and neck.
Yeah, but what I have noticed in the last 24 to 48 hours is much like your last guest. There hasn't been a lot of talk about the transition team that Trump has surrounded himself by this time, which is much more composed of, smart people with a lot of background knowledge, opposed to the nepotism that his team was in 2016. And I actually have a fair bit of hope based on that team, and I'm kind of surprised that it's not talked about more and that there's so much hysteria based on a second presidency.
And why do you think people are so fearful or just a bit concerned about what a second term could bring as a result of Trump being in power?
Let's be honest, these imagery is bombastic, and there are a lot of adjectives you could use for them that aren't radio appropriate.
And I appreciate that.
I also think, though, that there have been so many people who have vocally opposed him, both in government, in Congress, in the Senate, on public space, in the media, that he has a reason. I don't think it's necessarily unvalid to feel like people have been against him. And, those types of things bring out the worst in people. But what I hope brings out the best in him is his transition team. I think Tulsi Gabbard is someone that we should be talking about in an incredibly positive light. I also think that he's the only public figure, and now the only person in the race that ever gave a speech that talked about peace. The other side wanted to continue to perpetuate the war in Ukraine by sending more arms and by sending more money. Whether Trump can do what he says or not, we'll have to see. But, I was raised in a household where peace was the objective. And I'm
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff. You cut out there, but I definitely got the gist of what you were saying. We'll just get a quick email in here as well from Suzanne, and she writes, "Of course, he cannot do all he said he would. It won't happen. And when things go wrong or he doesn't succeed, he'll do what he's done all along and blame other people." And that was from Suzanne. We'd like to have Rosemary join us once again. She is a former Victoria-based journalist, now living in New Orleans. Rosemary, you hear some people, such as Jeff himself there, saying, it's not so much about Trump. We need to be talking more about his team and that he won't have this absolute power. What is your take on that? How much power does Trump, ultimately hold when it comes to some of these major decisions?
I mean, the real answer to that is whether they have control of the House and Senate, as well as the presidency.
And they did take control of the Senate, and it does look like they'll control the House of Representatives.
Right. And so that really gives extraordinary power to Trump to enact his policies. And I think it's so important to underline that the Republican Party completely coalesced around Trump and those policies. You did not see any daylight really between the leading figures of the party and Trump and his policies. At times, the only criticism he really got was when he walked back a little bit of the abortion sort of stance that he was personally willing to take compared to some of the other leaders in the party who have advocated and in fact voted for legislation that not only would ban abortions nationwide, but also would restrict most IVF practices, would restrict emergency contraception. So, again, from where I sit covering reproductive health, I think it is a mistake to look at the stated goals that Trump has said he wants to achieve, or even some of the musings he's stated in terms of, going after his opponents, for example, using the Justice Department. I think it's really important to take that at its word. And I'll tell you why. One of the reasons is that leading up to the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade, the thinking in the country absolutely was they'll never do that.
Right.
And the thinking was that would never happen.
And yet
it shocked the country. Exactly.
Yeah.
It shocked the country because people weren't prepared. And so actually, as a journalist, I really do take it seriously that I need to be prepared. I need to look at what are some of these consequences. And there is something called the Life at Conception Act. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has signed it. He's a Louisiana congressman. So have most of the Republicans in Congress who will be there with Trump.
Right.
And that has long been a key tenet of the Republican Party, including in their party platform this year, in which they state support for the 14th Amendment, which anti-abortion groups use to argue that life should be protected at conception. So I do think that as opposed to the first term, in fact, when there maybe was a little bit of you don't know exactly what a Trump administration would look like, I actually think we have a lot more information now about what a Trump administration should look like, and we should take those policy proposals seriously and expect him to make as much progress as he can on that, with the support of someone like Mike Johnson, who's also said the first 100 days will be an aggressive advancement of the policies of the Republican Party.
I do want to just take time for one more phone call here. Jane is joining us from Penticton. Jane, we only have a couple of minutes, but I understand you're having some very strong emotions today about last night's results.
Yes, shock, dismay, horror, depression, hopelessness, but I have to get my fighting gear back because I've got girls in the family that need to be protected. And what were they thinking? What were they thinking down there? He's the most ungodly man that you could put in. And what happens in the States creeps up into Canada. And birth control is in their line of fire now. Women's vote is in the line of fire now. And being that J.D. Vance has got all these peculiar ideas about women, and old women like myself are only supposed to be out there looking after children and grandchildren. Trump's got to start worrying now because he's old and he's getting decrepit, and Vance is young. He's a good friend of the son, and the enemy within is sitting right beside Mr. Trump now.
So you feel that perhaps J.D. Vance is the bigger worry than Trump himself?
Oh, gosh. I think there's a tie there.
We will have to leave it there, but I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. And Rosemary, just final thoughts from you. What are you watching for in the near and far future? Just we've got about a minute left. If you could just let us know sort of what's on your radar.
Well, certainly some of the concerns that caller raised. So when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, Justice Clarence Thomas cited other previous precedents he would also like to take another look at. Those include the right to gay marriage and the right to birth control. So I do think some of what I've already said is really where my focus will be. I think people have probably heard of Project 2025. I will be looking to see, is that implemented under the Trump administration? We already know that because Florida rejected an amendment to expand abortion rights, that will have an impact on women in the South who have the least access. They have to travel the furthest for care. So I'm going to be looking for the implications of also those abortion amendments on women's access to care.
All right. Rosemary, thank you so much for joining us today. So many good points, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
That was Rosemary Westwood, former CBC Victoria journalist, now based in New Orleans, living and working there as a reproductive health reporter. That's it for our show today. Thanks for calling in and joining the discussion.